Hello everyone, today is day 12 of our 30 days of watercolor flowers, and today we are painting French lavender. Instead of having the more typical flower petals that we think of when we see lavender, French lavender are kind of flowery in a square shape. It's like a big squishy square shape, and then it has these long lovely petals that come out the top. It's really quite beautiful, and typically when I buy lavender locally to me here in Arizona, this is the type of lavender that I get, and I think it's really beautiful. So I thought it would be fun to try painting French lavender this time, since in my last series I did the more traditional English lavender. This type of lavender can also be called Spanish lavender, and it can vary between more rectangular shapes, so longer, or more square shapes. So you can have fun with this. Look at some reference pictures and get a good idea for what you want your lavender to look like. They also have really simple stems and tiny little leaves. The square portion is really spongy feeling, but it is made up of bunches and bunches of these tiny little flowers. So think of all of these tiny little flowers that are squeezed so tightly together that they look like they form one unit, and that's how we're going to paint it. So we're going to start with a very light lavender color. So I'm picking up some purpley pink color and using a lot of water to make sure my mixture is not very pigmented, because with watercolor we start light to dark. And I'm just using the tip of my brush and some light pressure to push down and make these quick short strokes. So I'm giving the impression that there's a bunch of little flower petals, but they're all squeezed right next to each other. Then, using less water, we're going to pick up some purple and start mixing it with blue. This gives us a deeper, rich blue purple color for the contrast and the shadows. So while everything is still wet, we're going to go back in and tap just a tiny bit of color at the base of where we made those petal shapes. You'll want to wait until the original purple color, that light color, is almost dry, so you're not getting too much bleeding, because you definitely want a separation of the two colors with just a slight bleed, so there's a little bit of blending. I've picked up that same light purple color and we're going to create another bunch. So I start from the inside and then gradually bring the strokes out, just making round circular quick marks with the tip of my brush until I get that squarish shape that I want. And then again, going in with that dark purpley blue color for the shadows and the contrast. Remember, less is more, and focus on where you think the shadow colors would be, which would be at the base of those little shapes that you are creating. You can see that I'm maintaining some areas of white space, but I'm also letting some of my marks blend together. So we want some separation so that we can see that there are different petals. We don't just want one square blob to represent this color. We need a little bit more texture, and leaving some white space gives us that texture, because even in the lavender that we've painted with the darker sections, you can see that even with the darker sections, we can still see some of the white space and there's still a lot of texture. So you can tell that there are individual flowers, individual petals within one of those shapes. Just make sure that when you're adding in the darker contrasting color, you don't lose all of your white space, but you can lose some. Maintaining the texture and that you can tell that there are individual flowers within this little bunch is the key. So just continue to dot in that color and add a little bit more depth as you're going around and making these little bunches. You can see I've just gone through and made all of my bunches first. And now that everything is starting to dry, we get to go back and add our darkest color. So we've got our lightest color, our mid-tone color, and our darkest color. This is the one that is even more less is more. Just a little bit goes a long way. So you can see I'm just adding a touch of it near where I have my mid-tone color, and then I'm moving on. So we want to make sure all colors are evenly represented. This gives a lot of depth to watercolor because it can look really flat if you don't have a lot of degrees in color variation and layering. So if we can maintain that light color, the midtone color, and then add the darker contrast color, your paintings will really pop. And if you look at a reference picture, this is what the French lavender looks like. It has those light, airy ends of the petals, but has a lot of darkness within the grouping as well. Now we get to paint the petals that are coming out of these little bunches, and it's kind of like painting leaves. We're going to use the same kind of pressure techniques. And for the color, I'm using the same purple we've been using, but I added a little bit of pink to give it a brighter feeling. I like that it looks a little bit more distinct and different than the grouping. So it adds just another color, which adds to the interest of the piece. So I start with the middle few petals. Again, it looks kind of like a leaf where I'm using different variations of pressure to get a point at the end. And then I'm fanning out the petals on either side, doing smaller petals on the edges, thinner petals also on the edges, so it looks like it's from the side, and maybe a petal or two that is peeking out the top like a little triangle or something to show the different degrees and the layers of these top petals coming out of the flower bunch. The key to making them look organic is to not have them all perfect and to not have them all the same size. You want some to be wider, some to be thinner, them to be different shapes and going different directions. Use your brush and play with different amounts of pressure to get different looking petal shapes. Now I'm picking up some more pink and purple, mixing them together to get a high concentration of that pink color. So less water, more straight from the palette, and adding that in at the bottom of those petals to give lots of dimension. Some of the petals are still wet, so it gives it a nice bleeding effect. But having that pink color really be punchy at the bottom just gives so much depth and texture to these petals. The flowers are done and we are going to work on the greenery. So I'm mixing up some sap green with a little bit of red and some other greens and blues to get a really dark, moody green color. The color of the greenery on this type of lavender is like a bluish, moody green color. So remember that red and green are complementary colors. They cancel each other out and give that really deep, moody feel. And then I added a little bit of blue to continue in that darker hued color. And then we're just going to take the stems straight down. If you give them a little bit of curve, it adds to the whole movement of the piece. So we like to add just a tiny curve and then make the ends of the stems a little bit uneven. We don't want them to necessarily come down together at the same point. I'm using the shape of my brush to quickly pull down towards the stem to create these small leaves. Lavender leaves typically come in pairs together, so definitely feel like you can add them more symmetrical than we typically do, and you can also do little leaves that are on their own. I think the trick with making it not look so stiff is to always step back from your painting and see where you feel like it needs more of something and where maybe it's heavier on one side and needs a little something on the other side. It's all about balance. So that's what I'm doing now is I'm just adding the leaves until it feels balanced. Now I'm going to pick up sap green in a heavier concentration. You saw me tap my brush on the towel, so that means I have less water and a higher ratio of pigment. Then I'm able to go in and dab in more color to give more contrast and depth and shadow into my greenery. I'm using very light pressure with just the tip of my brush, and always remember when adding the contrasting color that less is more. And with that, our French lavender is finished. Now all we need to do is add it to the day 12 spot on our watercolor flower guide. Thank you so much for being here today while we painted day 12, the French lavender. I thought it was so fun to do a different kind of lavender than what we typically paint, but it's a lot more common from what I'm seeing around where I live locally. So I loved the switch up, and I will see you tomorrow for day 13. Bye.